There was a single meal that broke a German soldier's certainty. Not a feast, not a banquet. Just an ordinary breakfast on an ordinary morning in a prison camp somewhere in America. But that meal, those eggs, that bacon, that impossibly soft white bread, contained within it a question that this soldier couldn't answer, a contradiction he couldn't resolve, a crack in the foundation of everything he'd been taught to believe about the world. And once that crack appeared, it spread. Through his certainty, through his ideology, through the entire worldview that Nazi propaganda had constructed so carefully over more than a decade. One meal, that's all it took to begin the collapse. This is one of over 50 stories I'm sharing from World War II prison camps. New story every day. Subscribe so you don't miss them. Let me take you back to that morning in Kansas, 1943, and show you how a breakfast tray became a weapon more powerful than any bomb. The spring of 1943 was a turning point in the war. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps, Erwin Rommel's elite fighting force, was collapsing under overwhelming Allied superiority. German soldiers who had believed themselves invincible found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and out of options. By May 1943, over 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia. Among those captured were thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers who had absorbed Nazi propaganda so completely that defeat itself seemed impossible. These weren't reluctant conscripts. Many were true believers. They'd grown up in Hitler Youth, been educated in Nazi schools, absorbed the relentless propaganda that told them Germany was superior in every way that mattered. And they believed what they'd been told about America. Nazi propaganda had constructed a very specific image of the United States. America was weak, a nation of soft, undisciplined civilians who lacked martial spirit. America was racially degenerate, a mongrel nation where mixing of inferior races had created chaos. America was economically fragile, a country still reeling from the Great Depression, its resources stretched to breaking by a two-front war it couldn't sustain. Nazi newspapers printed articles about American food riots, bread lines, populations on the verge of starvation. Nazi films portrayed Americans as cowardly and incompetent. For German soldiers raised on this propaganda from childhood, it wasn't just political rhetoric, it was their understanding of reality. Of course, America was weak. Of course, Germany was superior. These were simply facts. Among the thousands captured in Tunisia was a corporal named Klaus Richter, 24 years old, from Hamburg, drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1940. Klaus wasn't an ideological fanatic. He joined Hitler Youth because everyone did, absorbed the propaganda because it was everywhere. But he believed it. America was weak, Germany was strong. These were just facts. Klaus had fought in France in 1940, watched the French army collapse in 6 weeks. He'd fought in North Africa, where German forces had consistently outfought larger British armies. Every experience reinforced what he'd been taught. German soldiers were simply better. German victory was inevitable. The surrender in Tunisia shook him. But Klaus had been taught to explain away setbacks. They were temporary. Once Germany's new weapons were deployed, the tide would turn. After capture, Klaus spent 3 weeks in a British holding camp. The British provided the minimum required by Geneva Convention: adequate food to prevent starvation, basic shelter. The treatment wasn't cruel, but it wasn't generous. Then came the transfer to American custody. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks aboard a Liberty ship, and it was the food on the ship that created the first real crack in Klaus's certainty. 3 meals a day, served with routine regularity. Breakfast brought eggs, multiple eggs per man, bacon or sausage. White bread softer than any bread Klaus had eaten even before the war. Real butter, real coffee with real sugar. Lunch and dinner followed the same pattern. Sandwiches with actual meat. Thick soups. Main courses of beef or chicken, fresh vegetables and desserts. Cake, pie, pudding. Klaus ate that first breakfast slowly, waiting for the trick. This had to be temporary propaganda. No nation fighting a two-front war could afford to feed prisoners this well. But the meals didn't stop. Day after day, for 2 weeks, the food kept coming. And Klaus noticed something disturbing: the waste. American sailors threw away food. Not spoiled food, but perfectly edible surplus. Eggs that had been cooked but not served. Bread that was a day old. Meat held too long in warming trays. In Germany, waste was a crime. People were arrested for throwing away food. German civilians were eating bread mixed with sawdust. And here were Americans casually throwing away more food in a day than Klaus's family in Hamburg saw in a week. It didn't make sense. The train ride to Camp Phillips, Kansas took 3 days. Klaus travelled in actual passenger cars with cushioned seats. He stared out the window at America. He saw cities that were intact, undamaged, bustling. He saw factories with smoke pouring from chimneys. He saw highways filled with cars and trucks. He saw farms with enormous barns, modern equipment. He saw grocery stores displaying pyramids of canned goods. He saw a country that looked nothing like the failing, desperate nation that Nazi propaganda had described. The prisoner sitting next to Klaus, a lieutenant named Werner Schmidt, voiced what Klaus was thinking. "Nothing about this matches what we were told," Werner said quietly in German. "Look at it. The abundance. This isn't a country on the verge of collapse." Klaus nodded but said nothing. Acknowledging the discrepancy felt dangerous. Camp Phillips sprawled across several hundred acres of Kansas prairie. It housed 4,000 German prisoners in orderly rows of barracks. The barracks shocked Klaus. Electric lights, central heating, indoor plumbing with flush toilets and hot showers, screened windows, clean mattresses and blankets. Klaus had lived in worse conditions as a soldier fighting for Germany, but Klaus knew the real test would be the food. You could build nice barracks cheaply, but feeding 4,000 men day after day, that required sustained resources. That's where propaganda's claims about American food shortages would prove true. The first breakfast at Camp Phillips was on a cool July morning in 1943. The mess hall smell hit Klaus immediately. Bacon frying, coffee brewing, bread baking. Klaus joined the line. He picked up a metal tray. American workers placed food on his tray. 2 fried eggs, yolk still runny. 3 strips of bacon, crispy and hot. Hash-browned potatoes, golden brown and steaming. 4 slices of white bread, soft and fresh. Real butter. Strawberry jam and orange marmalade. Oatmeal with brown sugar and milk. Fresh orange slices. Real coffee with sugar and cream. Cold milk. Klaus stood there staring at the food. This single breakfast contained more calories than his mother and sister in Hamburg received in an entire day. This one meal had more protein than German civilians got in a week. The fresh orange, a luxury German children might see once a year at Christmas, was just routine. Klaus sat down. Nobody spoke. They all stared at their trays with the same expression. Confusion mixed with fear. Because this much food, served this casually to enemy prisoners, contradicted everything they'd been taught. One prisoner, a young private named Hans, started to cry. Quiet tears as he looked at his breakfast. "My little brother," Hans said softly in German. "He's 8 years old. He hasn't seen an egg in 6 months. He hasn't tasted real butter in 2 years. And here I sit, a prisoner, eating this." Werner picked up a slice of white bread, examined it carefully. "This bread alone tells you everything," Werner said. "To make bread this soft, this white, you need pure wheat flour. No fillers, no substitutes. America can afford to give pure wheat bread to prisoners. Germany can't afford to give it to its own citizens." Klaus cut into one of the eggs. The yolk ran across his plate, rich and golden. He took a bite, and that's when Klaus felt something break inside him. A wall he'd built to protect his beliefs, to maintain his certainty in German superiority. That wall developed a crack. If America was weak and resource-poor, how could they afford to feed prisoners this well? If America was on the verge of economic collapse, how could they waste food? If American agriculture was failing, where did all this abundance come from? Klaus tried to answer using propaganda's framework. Maybe this camp was special, a showcase for Red Cross inspectors. Maybe the food would be cut back soon. But Klaus recognized logistics when he saw it. The mess hall operation was routine, systematic, organized for sustained operation. The kitchen had industrial equipment, massive storage, supply chains designed for long-term feeding of thousands. This wasn't propaganda. This was simply how Americans fed their prisoners, which meant the propaganda had lied, comprehensively lied about American resource capacity. And if the propaganda lied about that, what else had it lied about? Over the following days, Klaus watched carefully. The abundance didn't decrease. Every breakfast brought eggs, meat, bread, butter, fruit, coffee. Every lunch brought sandwiches or hot meals with soup and dessert. Every dinner brought substantial portions of beef or pork or chicken. Klaus started doing calculations. He'd always been good with numbers. Camp Phillips was feeding 4,000 prisoners a approximately 3,200 calories per day each, almost 4 billion calories per year, and Camp Phillips was just one of over 500 camps across America holding more than 400,000 Axis prisoners. The United States was providing over 1 billion calories per day to enemy prisoners. That didn't include feeding American civilians, American military, food shipped to Allied forces overseas, or supplies sent to Britain and the Soviet Union. The scale of American agricultural production necessary to sustain all of that was staggering. It wasn't just more than Germany, it was multiples more. Completely different category of capacity. Germany was supposed to be superior, yet America, with all its supposed chaos and democratic inefficiency, was producing food on a scale that made Germany look like a struggling peasant economy. How was that possible? Klaus started paying attention to other details. The waste continued to bother him. Kitchen staff threw away huge quantities of surplus food daily, not scraps or spoiled items, but edible surplus that regulations required to be discarded. Klaus volunteered for kitchen duty to see the waste up close. Trash bins filled with food that German civilians would consider treasure. 40 pounds of day-old bread thrown out in a single morning. 20 pounds of cooked meat discarded after lunch. Gallons of milk poured down drains. The American kitchen supervisor noticed Klaus staring. "I know it seems wasteful," the supervisor said slowly, "but regulations say we can't serve day-old food or anything held too long at temperature. Health and safety." They were throwing away food not because they didn't have enough, but because they had so much that food safety was the bigger concern than food security. In Germany, food security was everything, but America had enough food that they worried more about freshness than scarcity. Klaus also noticed the variety. Fresh fruit appeared regularly: oranges, apples, pears, grapes. Vegetables included things Klaus had rarely eaten: asparagus, artichokes, fresh spinach. Meat wasn't just beef, but also pork, chicken, turkey, occasionally lamb or fish. This diversity required sophisticated supply chains, refrigeration, transportation networks producing dozens of different products simultaneously. Germany had never achieved that kind of food system sophistication, even before the war. If you're new here, there are 46 more stories already waiting for you on the channel. 2 months into captivity, Klaus was assigned to a work detail at a farm 20 miles from camp. The farm was owned by a family named Johnson, Swedish Americans who had worked the land for 3 generations. The farm was enormous: 800 acres of wheat, corn and soybeans, 300 head of cattle, modern equipment including 4 tractors, 2 combines, and machinery Klaus had never seen. Klaus's first day taught him more about American agricultural capacity than 2 months of eating American food. Mr. Johnson demonstrated the combine harvester. The machine was massive and remarkably efficient. It could cut, thresh, and clean wheat in a single pass. One man operating the combine could harvest 100 acres per day, work that would require dozens of men weeks to accomplish using German methods. "My grandfather farmed this land with horses and hand tools," Mr. Johnson said slowly. "Took him and 5 hired men 3 weeks to harvest 100 acres. Now I do it in a day by myself." American agriculture had undergone a technological revolution that Germany had never matched. German farms still relied heavily on animal power and manual labour, and this wasn't even a specially advanced farm. Mr. Johnson made clear his operation was typical for the region. Thousands of farms across the Midwest used similar equipment, operated on similar scales. At lunch, Mrs. Johnson brought food to the field. She served the German prisoners the same lunch the Johnson family ate: thick sandwiches with ham and cheese, potato salad, fresh corn, apples, cookies, lemonade. Klaus sat in the shade eating lunch with other prisoners and the Johnson family. The Johnsons treated them like hired workers, not enemies. They made conversation, asked about the prisoners' families, shared stories about their own sons serving overseas. One Johnson son, Thomas, was in the Army Air Corps, training to be a bomber pilot. Mrs. Johnson showed Klaus a photograph of Thomas in uniform. "He wants to fly missions over Europe," Mrs. Johnson said with worry. "I pray every night he comes home safe." Klaus looked at the photograph of this American boy who would soon be dropping bombs on Germany, possibly killing German civilians like Klaus's own family. And here was Thomas's mother, serving lunch to German prisoners, treating them with kindness. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Their son was training to kill Germans, yet they treated German prisoners with hospitality. In Germany, treatment of prisoners, especially Soviet prisoners, was brutal and often lethal. Nazi ideology taught that mercy was weakness. Yet here were Americans showing kindness to enemies while simultaneously fighting them with devastating effectiveness. Werner put it into words one evening as prisoners rode back to camp. "They're stronger than we are," Werner said quietly in German. "Not just militarily or economically, morally. They can afford to be kind because they're so confident in their strength. That's real power." Klaus wanted to argue but couldn't. Germany treated prisoners harshly because it feared them, because it was actually weak behind the facade of strength. America treated prisoners well because it was genuinely strong enough to afford generosity. Everything was backwards from what propaganda had taught. 3 months into captivity, American authorities established an education program. German prisoners were offered classes in English, American history, democratic governance, and vocational skills. Klaus signed up for English class, taught by a retired teacher named Mrs. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson used American newspapers as teaching materials. What struck Klaus immediately was what the newspapers contained: articles critical of government policies, reports on labour strikes, stories about racial discrimination, editorials attacking the president's decisions. In Germany, such criticism was illegal. Newspapers were state-controlled. Any criticism meant arrest, possibly death. "Why do you allow this?" Klaus asked Mrs. Anderson one day, pointing to an editorial harshly criticising President Roosevelt. "This is attacking your leader. In Germany, this would be treason." Mrs. Anderson smiled slightly. "That's the difference between democracy and dictatorship, Klaus. In a free society, citizens have the right to criticize their government. That criticism makes us stronger, not weaker. It helps us find and fix problems." The logic was clear, but it contradicted everything Klaus had been taught about strength requiring unity and discipline. Yet the evidence was undeniable. America, with all its open debate and permitted criticism, was winning the war. Germany, with all its unity and discipline, was losing. Maybe strength didn't come from suppressing dissent. Maybe it came from the confidence to allow it. That Christmas, the local Kansas community organized a celebration for the German prisoners. Churches collected gifts. Boy Scouts made Christmas cards. Families donated hand-knitted scarves and gloves. Women's clubs baked cookies. The camp put up decorations, including a large Christmas tree. On Christmas Eve, prisoners gathered for a special meal: roast turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, candied sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, green beans, dinner rolls, pumpkin pie, apple pie, chocolate cake. Then a local church choir sang Christmas carols, including several in German. Stille Nacht, O Tannenbaum, vom Himmel hoch. Families from the community distributed Christmas packages, one for each prisoner. Klaus opened his package: wool socks, a bar of soap, homemade cookies, and a Christmas card from a family named Peterson. It included a photograph and a brief note. "Merry Christmas. We hope this finds you well. We pray for your safety and your family's safety. We hope this terrible war ends soon and you can return home. God bless you. The Peterson family." Klaus sat holding the card, staring at the photograph of this American family who had prepared a gift for an enemy prisoner, who had written a kind message, who had prayed for his safety. The Petersons had no reason to care about Klaus, yet they had shown him this kindness, this recognition of shared humanity that transcended nationality and conflict. Klaus felt tears running down his face. He wasn't alone. All around the hall, German prisoners were crying as they opened packages, read cards, encountered kindness from people they had been taught to hate. And in that moment, Klaus's ideological certainty, already cracked by months of contradictions, finally collapsed completely. He couldn't deny the truth anymore, couldn't rationalize it away. The propaganda had lied about everything. America wasn't weak, it was the strongest nation on earth. Americans weren't inferior. They were confident enough in their strength to show kindness to enemies. Democracy wasn't chaotic and failing. It was resilient and effective. And Germany, the supposedly superior master race, was losing because German superiority was a lie. The entire Nazi ideology was built on false premises that couldn't survive contact with reality. Klaus made a decision. He would learn everything he could about America. He would figure out how this system worked, why it was more successful, what made it so productive and powerful and, somehow, humane, even in the midst of total war. The war continued for another year and a half. Klaus remained at Camp Phillips, worked at farms, continued English classes, watched the steady stream of news about German defeats. Each defeat vindicated what Klaus had learned from his breakfast tray and every meal since. Germany had never stood a chance. One meal hadn't taught Klaus all of this. One breakfast hadn't instantly converted him. But one meal had created the first crack in his certainty. And through that crack, reality had begun to seep in. Day after day, meal after meal, the cracks had spread. The wall of propaganda had crumbled, and Klaus had been forced to confront the truth. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Klaus felt no surprise. Of course, Germany lost. How could a system built on lies defeat a system built on freedom and productivity? Klaus was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He returned to Hamburg to find his city in ruins, his family alive but struggling on starvation rations. Klaus worked in reconstruction for 3 years. He applied the agricultural knowledge he'd learned in Kansas. He taught English classes. He advocated for democratic reform. And in 1949, he immigrated to the United States. The process took 2 years. Eventually, Mr. Johnson, the Kansas farmer Klaus had worked for, agreed to sponsor him. In 1951, Klaus Richter became an American citizen. He married an American woman, raised American children, and spent 35 years managing the Johnson farm. And for the rest of his life, when people asked about his experience as a prisoner, Klaus would talk about that first breakfast at Camp Phillips, about the eggs and bacon, about the orange slices and real coffee, about the abundance that contradicted everything he'd been taught. "That meal saved my life," Klaus would say, "not because I was starving, because it made me question everything. And once you start questioning, once you let reality challenge your beliefs, you can't go back to comfortable lies. That breakfast was the beginning of my education in truth." That's the power of one meal. Not to fill a stomach, not just to provide nutrition, but to create a question that ideology couldn't answer, to present evidence that propaganda couldn't explain away, to demonstrate a truth that no amount of indoctrination could hide. One meal made Klaus question everything he knew, and in questioning he discovered something better than what he'd been taught to believe. Tomorrow's story. What happened when Italian prisoners walked into an American supermarket for the first time and couldn't process what they were seeing. Subscribe so you catch it. New story every day. Consider this. How many times has a simple experience challenged what you believe to be true? How many of your certainties are built on what you've been told rather than what you've experienced? And how much courage does it take to let one meal, one moment, one contradiction be the beginning of real understanding rather than denial? Klaus Richter found that courage in a breakfast tray in Kansas, and it changed his life. Perhaps that's the most important lesson, that truth is more powerful than propaganda, that reality ultimately defeats ideology, and that sometimes the most transformative experiences come in the most ordinary packages, even in something as simple as eggs and bacon on a Tuesday morning.